we'll have the latest reaction from the US and around the globe. See the headlines as they happen with breaking news alerts in the app and get the full story with bbc.com/news. Follow the latest from the US election with BBC News.
As the coronavirus pandemic continues, BBC News has in-depth coverage.
Coronavirus is still coursing its way through the community.
The approaches to Hubei province like scenes from an apocalyptic movie.
The region locked down when Europe did, and it's unlocking now and unnerving many.
See the headlines as they happen with breaking news alerts in the app and get the full story with bbc.com/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.
India's rapid economic growth of the last decade has come to a screeching halt, made worse by the coronavirus pandemic that's thrown millions out of work. And it's the younger generation that's most affected by the looming employment catastrophe. Now on BBC World News, Talking Business Asia.
The coronavirus pandemic has thrown millions of people out of work. It has also pulled back the curtain on India's economic success, revealing a jobs crisis. With nearly 10 million people entering the workforce every year, the most affected remain the country's younger generation. I'm Arunoday Mukharji, and today we talk about India's young and jobless. Welcome to Talking Business Asia. Since the pandemic, 1 out of every 6 young Indians have lost their jobs. Now, while there has been some recovery as the economy gradually started opening up, but in October, employment fell once again with nearly 12 million people actively looking for jobs. But the reality is that the unemployment crisis in India has been around long before COVID-19. My colleague Nikhil Namdar explains.
India is a country of 1.3 billion people and 2 out of 3 Indians are below the age of 35. That's a young population that would be requiring jobs now and in the future. The World Bank estimates India needs to create 8 million jobs annually to absorb all those entering the workforce each year. But in reality, not even half as many jobs are being created. In fact, even before COVID-19, for the last few decades, while India's economy grew at more than 5% every year, unemployment should have been falling. But instead, it also continued to rise. And that's what economists call jobless growth. And now, because of COVID-19, millions are still out of work.
And lockdown was announced, the first lockdown. One was hoping that this would subside and things would improve with time. But now we know that wasn't the case. So the management took a unanimous decision to let go of the entire team.
My parents are expecting a result from my placements, but were only left with disappointment. The pandemic has ruined the life of every new fresh graduates like me.
Because of the coronavirus-induced pandemic, I lost my job. A settled life became unsettled in a matter of few days.
Previous Indian governments from various political parties have not been able to solve the jobs problem. While countries like China, Bangladesh and Vietnam were creating a labour-intensive manufacturing sector, India failed to do so. Reasons are tedious bureaucracy, a difficult business environment and complex labour regulations. Top that with an inability to create a skilled workforce means Indian workers are not just unemployed, they're often unemployable.
We fail to find the right kind of candidates with right education and skill for the job. They just have basic theoretical knowledge, tomorrow our practical knowledge. So we need to basically invest in them for another 2 years in giving them more practical knowledge, and which is hitting the bottom line.
To make matters worse, a rapid rise in the use of technology and automation means machines have begun replacing people. An entire generation of Indians faces the prospect of a bleak future made only much worse by the pandemic.
Not only me, but most of the students which are of my age are under mental pressure.
They are only looking for experienced people, and why they will invest in us, because we don't have anything to show them right now.
To break out of this vicious cycle, India needs to grow at least 8 to 8.5% levels in the post-COVID world, according to consulting firms like McKinsey. And the country needs the right kind of growth, one that will create millions of jobs that young Indians so desperately seek. Nikhil Ananda, BBC News, Mumbai.
So as we just heard, creating jobs in a country like India has always been challenging, and COVID-19 has just made a bad situation even worse. So what kind of economic growth does India need to employ the millions who are coming into the workforce every year? Are policymakers doing enough on the jobs front? With me today is Sadia Zahidi, Managing Director at the World Economic Forum. Thanks very much, Sadia, for your time here on Talking Business Asia. I'd like to begin by asking you, how do you see the unemployment crisis unfolding here in a country like India in, say, the next 3 to 4 years?
So let me start with a bit of the global picture, and then we'll talk specifically about India. When it comes to the global picture, what's happening in the Indian workforce is very similar to other parts of the world in the sense of this sort of double disruption. And that double disruption is, on the one hand, the pandemic and the recession that has created, combined with the threat of automation that was frankly there already for some years, but is essentially being accelerated at this present time.
So with the current pandemic, Sadia, how do you think India has been adapting?
I think, like a lot of countries, there is an ongoing uncertainty which relates to the pandemic. And that is a global concern, and that makes it very hard for policymakers and decision makers to be able to move ahead with any kind of certainty. At the same time, what we found is that the countries that are using this moment, this sort of crisis, to build in the investments for the future are likely to do the best. So for example, this is a good moment to put in place social safety nets that are going to be required as workers transition from job A to job B. This is a good moment to put in place investments towards what we are calling markets of tomorrow.
So like you said, the uncertainty is making it difficult for policymakers to move ahead. So how alarming is it likely to be for India in the near future?
I think for a country like India, as well as other large emerging markets with large youth populations, the critical factor is education and reskilling and upskilling of workers. If that is in place, then there is absolutely still a short window of opportunity that's available to be able to support the workforce in making the transition that's required. If not, then of course the social consequences can be absolutely devastating, because people will not have the ability to earn a livelihood in the way that they've been able to in the past. There has to be one set of efforts that looks at the high-skilled workers, but there equally has to be a set of efforts that looks at the trades, that looks at lower-skilled workers, that looks at giving more digital access across the economy.
Do you think it makes matters more challenging in a country like India, where the informal sector is more than 50% of the economy?
Yeah, this is where the social safety nets become incredibly important, because governments will have to think very differently about the kind of cash transfers and income support they will need to provide to informal workers. Without that, you are looking at some predictions from, for example, the World Bank and others that would say that we could have 500 million people across the world move back into poverty, reversing essentially the gains that have been made in the past decades. And so without some form of cash transfers and safety nets, it will not be possible for many people in the informal economy to be able to make the transition and to be able to provide livelihoods for their families in the next few months.
And Sadia, what do you think has been the biggest obstacle for the government's ability to create more jobs? Because like we've been saying, this has been a problem plaguing India for a very long time.
You know, certainly I won't be able to provide a lot of direct commentary specifically on the situation in India, but I think if we look over the last few years, a lot of growth has come, for example, from the IT sector, but it has tended to not be distributed equally. So what's required is much more effort that actually tries to change distribution patterns across an economy, give better risks, rewards, returns to everybody across a population, as opposed to being concentrated in one sector. So I think in general, over the last few years, we found that most governments have not been putting in place these bold, big investments that are required for the future.
Would you say the government of India is prepared with the right kind of policies in place to cater to a situation you've described that may be emerging in the near future?
What we've tried to do is put together information from leading businesses, including those in India, to understand where do they see the future going and where do they see some of the gaps. Is it clear that the skill sets that the workforce needs are missing? Yes. And so, for example, if you look at emerging skills, analytical thinking and innovation, complex problem solving, technology design and programming, emotional intelligence, creativity, technology use, these are all either very technology-driven skills or very human skills and traits that most education systems are not good at delivering. So this is agnostic of the specific situation in India. This is almost a universal problem, that what we are getting out of education and training systems is just not good enough for what is actually required inside labor markets. And so that's one area where things will absolutely have to change to ensure that people are well set up for the future.
Now, the latest World Economic Forum report says that half of all tasks will be done by machines in the next 5 years. Does this mean, going ahead, Indians could be losing out to machines?
So I think one thing I want to state up front is that technological change does not necessarily equal a disappearance of jobs. So what we found overall is that the growth in jobs because of technology is still going to be larger in terms of absolute numbers than the decline in jobs. Now, at the same time, it's very clear that a large number of jobs will be displaced, even though a large number of jobs will be gained. And it's very clear that because of the pandemic, the rate of job creation has slowed down greatly compared to 2 years ago, and the rate of job destruction has definitely gone up in the last 2 years as well. So with those caveats, it is absolutely possible to think of technology as a job creator rather than a job destroyer. But again, it comes down to skills, and it comes down to investments that are in part directed and supported by the government towards sort of the right kind of sectors for the future, whether that's green or care or education or whatever the case may be. Specifically in India, we found that when it comes to the impact of technology adoption. So for example, a number of companies are saying that they're adopting cloud computing, they're adopting more cybersecurity, they're adopting more Internet of Things, they're adopting more big data analytics. Now, these are all areas where to some extent, yes, they will displace current roles, but they will still create more roles than the current situation.
The women labor participation rate in India has always been poor. Now, how critical is this going to be as India looks to rebuild itself in a post-pandemic world?
So this is an area where we're seeing quite a few concerns in both advanced and emerging markets. There's almost a sort of return to the home, and not in the sense of working from home, but women are facing a dual burden. They're facing a burden of caregiving responsibilities, whether it's elder care or childcare inside the home, and at the same time, they still have a shift at the workplace, whether they're doing that from home or whether they're doing that outside. So that's for women who are working. I think what you're starting to see now is an overall retraction where even women who were working are starting to now take the decision that they may stay at home instead of returning to the workforce, because it's not possible with school closures and other changes for them to be able to perform their care responsibilities inside the home.
Your thoughts, your advice to the Indian establishment as it deals with this uncertainty in the near future, as it deals with an impending unemployment crisis, and also, continuing to see rising numbers, perhaps even a second wave in the next month or so?
I think the key message that's coming out of all of the conversations, all of the economies that we work with and that we speak to, skills are the new currency of the labor market. And that is where the focus has to be. That's what's going to prepare people to be able to work with machines rather than to compete with machines. That's what's going to prepare most economies for a long-term revival, as opposed to staying within a sort of U or an L-shape type of recovery. And that is what's going to be absolutely necessary for ensuring that we do get to more of that inclusive and sustainable world that we all economies need to try to aspire to.
Sadia Zaidi, thank you very much for your time here on Talking Business Asia. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Now, last year, out of the 403 million people who were employed, only 11% were women. And today, they face an even bigger challenge. Studies show that women who lose their jobs now will find it much harder to join the workforce in the future. Even before COVID-19, better education and university degrees have not always translated into a job for most women. In fact, one measurement shows their decreasing participation in the economy. Women's contribution to the country's GDP growth per capita has been falling. As Sadia pointed out, in this health crisis, working women also face a difficult balancing act with being caregivers and professionals. Here's what some women had to say about the challenges they face.
As the primary caregiver to my child, it is extremely hard to juggle between my professional life as well as be at home.
I was called by my employer and he shared that he could no longer afford to pay me. And without much notice, I was asked to quit. Almost it took me a week to just come out of that whole emotional turbulence that I was going through. And and when I did start my job search, I would have probably reached out to 700 to 1,000 senior HR professionals across the country. There are not many vacancies for someone like me who has long years of work experience.
I faced a lot of difficulties finding the internships, finding the jobs. Also along with that, like right now we are about to get placed, we are facing issues with our placements as well because companies have freezed their hiring.
The coronavirus pandemic has revealed cracks in India's social safety net as well as its education system, which is just not able to train India's youngsters with the right mix of skills. So now that we know the problems, can India fix them? That's coming up after the break.
The impact of the lockdown due to COVID on our economies will be significant.
I started to witness firsthand the effects of this health emergency and the negative impact it is having on people's lives.
There's a lot of unanswered questions that us as athletes and people around the world need to know.
It's kind of like a science fiction movie, but it's real.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC. As we face the world's greatest environmental challenges, what we need most is solutions. Our new website, Future Planet, brings you stories of the people who are working to make the world a sustainable place. And because we're committed to carbon-conscious reporting, we'll work with local reporters from around the globe to bring you incredible insight with a reduced carbon footprint. Future Planet, solutions for a sustainable world.
Welcome back. Now, the International Labour Organization has warned that COVID-19's economic fallout is disproportionately affecting young people and that the younger workers could be left behind. Now, as the jobs crisis worsens in India, what can the Indian government do to create more jobs? With me today is Mahesh Vyas of the Centre for Monitoring the Indian Economy, as well as Montek Singh Ahluwalia, economist and former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India. Thanks very much to both of you for your time here on Talking Business Asia. Dr. Ahluwalia, if I could begin with you first. If you were still in that government position of policy making, what would your advice be to the present leadership?
You know, the key point here is that the economy had slowed down even before COVID-19. I mean, the growth rate in the last year before COVID-19 was only about 4%. Now, it's very clear to me that looking ahead, a 4% growth rate will be a disaster. The Indian economy has enough potential productivity gains and other kind of benefits to reap to be able to get to something above 7%. India needs to chart out a course where it maintains an open economy and does everything possible to increase competitiveness. I mean, there's a whole range of things on the financial system, which actually I think have probably top priority.
Now, the pandemic and its financial implications is one aspect, but Mr. Vyas, why has India been stuck in this spiral of jobless growth?
Well, we have been stuck in the jobless growth phenomena for a fairly long time. But there's a difference. Earlier, we used to move people out of the farm sectors into factories. Now, even that is not happening. So we have had a problem with jobs, and that's partly because much of the investments in India has happened into capital-intensive industry, and labor-intensive industries, or those industries that use a good mix of labor and capital, have not received that much of investments so as to spur job-intensive growth.
So, Mr. Vyas, why do you think the government has failed to foresee this? Why didn't they create more job opportunities in these areas, or pump in more investment in these specific areas?
At least from outside, it looks like that the government, at least the present dispensation, seems to have not entirely understood the problem of jobs correctly, because much of the government statement has hovered around saying that we don't necessarily have to work towards creating jobs, but create people who can be self-employed. I think that's misdirected. It is important for the economy to produce good quality jobs in large companies, preferably large, globally competitive private sector companies, and there is a need for government jobs as well. If we are saying that we should continue having self-employed people to be the major portion of our labor force, I think that's misdirected, and that's not going to work, and it hasn't worked so far.
Dr. Ahluwalia, if I could come to you, you were part of the previous government as well in your capacity as Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. Do you think there has been a lack of foresight on part of successive governments which has brought the unemployment problem to this stage?
You know, I think this whole discussion is a bit complicated because you're looking at longer term trends, but you're looking at it in the context of a current very severe crisis, which not only India, but all countries are facing. So looking at the longer term issue, I think for some time, there's been a concern that we're not producing enough jobs to absorb the expected shift of population from agriculture, which actually did begin to happen several years ago. Jobs did get created. You had a growth rate of 7.5%, which is, pretty good. But within that, I think there was more jobs being created, which were of an informal kind, of a contractual kind. And, one of the arguments given for that is that the labor legislation that we have are too restrictive.
Right. India is underserved by the government of India, by the state governments of India, and the governments of India need to stop giving an excuse that we are financially constrained and cannot provide government jobs, and therefore cannot provide government services. So the first thing is we need to come out of this trap. So the government must provide jobs and must fix its fiscal problems. The second way in which we can move ahead is to ensure that the private sector is enthused into investing. So make a better environment for the private sector to function efficiently, and do build an employment in the government sector so that it can provide the right kind of services to the people.
Dr. Ahluwalia, of course, automation has been hastened because of the pandemic, and while people are adapting to a new way of working, do you think this could make matters worse in India?
Whenever you get a very rapid structural change, it causes problems somewhere and it has benefits elsewhere. I don't believe, by the way, that holding back technological change is the answer. But I think we need to be aware that if India is going to be competitive, it cannot hold back from adopting many of the techniques of automation, which otherwise generate a lot of efficiencies. But the consequence of that is that many existing jobs probably will shrink, and certainly in future, some of them may get eliminated entirely. The name of the game is, are we running the system in a way in which enough new jobs are being created? A hell of a lot has to be done on training, retraining, but most of all the education system, which is, after all, what provides the basic skills that the labor force needs to cope with this changing situation. The education system has to do its job. And I think we've failed in that for a long time. I mean, we haven't actually been very good at delivering traditional skills. And now we are faced with a situation where we have to develop new skills.
Thanks very much, Mahesh Vyas and Montek Singh Ahluwalia, for your thoughts. So as you heard through the course of the conversations on this show, it is critical that India recognize the challenges, create jobs, educate, reskill the workforce. Otherwise, the economic success India has enjoyed in the past will not be enough to cater to the challenges of the future. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.
Hello, looks like a strengthening hurricane will affect parts of Central America later on Monday. That story and more coming up in the next 3 minutes as we take a look around the world of weather. First off, though, to the USA and Canada, areas of low pressure initially coming into British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest of the USA, then tracking further east. One of them reaching towards the Great Lakes then for Sunday. Northern flank of that, parts of Ontario and Quebec seeing some heavy snow, then some ice, then some rain on the southern flank as this front covers more of the eastern side of the USA. A few strong storms associated with that. More wind, rain and some snow, especially to higher ground in towards the northwest. A lot of dry weather to the south, a lot of dry weather into Mexico. A few storms are affecting southern areas. This is all the rain